Welcome to our video, where today we're diving into some of the most heartbreaking and infuriating cases in legal history. These are 10 of the most egregious miscarriages of justice, where innocent individuals were wrongfully convicted, sentenced to death, and later exonerated. Each of these tragic stories showcases the devastating consequences that arise when the justice system fails, whether through human error, racial bias, false testimony, or prosecutorial misconduct. Many of these individuals spent years, sometimes decades, on death row, enduring unimaginable hardships while fighting to prove their innocence. Their exonerations came too late to erase the emotional and physical toll, but they serve as a powerful reminder of the imperfections in our judicial processes. These cases not only highlight the fragility of justice, but also raise significant questions about the use of the death penalty and the urgent need for reform. Let's dive into these tragic stories and reflect on the cost of these wrongful convictions. Number 10. Curtis Flowers, wrongfully convicted in 1997. In July 1996, 4 people were murdered inside a furniture store in Winona, Mississippi. The police zeroed in on Curtis Flowers, an African-American man who had been fired from the store 2 weeks earlier. Over the years, Flowers was tried 6 times, 4 of which resulted in convictions and death sentences. In 2019, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned his conviction due to racial bias in jury selection. New evidence and alternative suspects emerged, leading the state to drop all charges. Curtis Flowers spent over 20 years on death row for a crime he didn't commit. Number 9. Glenn Ford, wrongfully convicted in 1984. Glenn Ford was arrested for the murder of Isidore Roseman in Shreveport, Louisiana in 1983, despite minimal physical evidence connecting him to the crime. Convicted largely because of gunshot residue on his hand and a stolen item, Ford was sentenced to death. It wasn't until 2014 that information about the real killer surfaced, leading to Ford's exoneration. Sadly, he was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer shortly after his release and passed away in 2015, without receiving any compensation for his wrongful conviction. Number 8. Anthony Porter, wrongfully convicted in 1983. Convicted for a double murder in Chicago, Anthony Porter came within 48 hours of execution in 1998 before his case was re-examined. Northwestern University students uncovered new evidence, including a confession from another man, All-Story Simon. Porter spent 17 years on death row, and though exonerated, he was denied compensation. His case became a key factor in Illinois abolishing the death penalty. Number 7. Walter McMillian, wrongfully convicted in 1988. Walter McMillian, a black man from Alabama, was sentenced to death for the murder of a white woman, despite overwhelming evidence proving his innocence. The case was based on false witness testimony coerced by the police. McMillian sat on death row for 6 years, until his conviction was overturned in 1993. Despite his release, McMillian never received an apology from the state. His case is a haunting example of racial injustice. Number 6. Ron Keine and his motorcycle club, wrongfully convicted in 1974. Ron Keine and his friends from a motorcycle club were wrongfully convicted of murdering a college student in New Mexico. They were in Los Angeles at the time, but a motel maid's false testimony led to their conviction. Their sentences were overturned in 1975 after another man, Kerry Rodney Lee, confessed to the crime. Despite their exoneration, Keine and his friends spent nearly a year on death row for a crime they did not commit. Number 5. Sabrina Butler, wrongfully convicted in 1990. At just 17 years old, Sabrina Butler was sentenced to death for allegedly killing her infant son. In reality, her frantic attempts to resuscitate him had caused internal injuries. her defense failed to prove her innocence, and she became the only woman on Mississippi's death row. After serving over 6 years, her conviction was overturned in 1995, with new evidence proving her son's death was a tragic accident. Number 4. Gary Drinkard, wrongfully convicted in 1995. Gary Drinkard was wrongfully convicted of murder in Alabama after his half-sister and her partner testified against him in exchange for reduced sentences for their own crimes. With poor legal representation, Drinkard was sentenced to death. After nearly 6 years on death row, a new trial exonerated him in 2001, as evidence showed he was home during the murder and had a debilitating back injury. Number 3. Randall Dale Adams, wrongfully convicted in 1977. Randall Dale Adams was sentenced to death for the murder of a Texas police officer, though the crime was actually committed by David Ray Harris, a young hitchhiker Adams had met. The case inspired the 1988 documentary The Thin Blue Line, which led to Adams's exoneration. His conviction was overturned in 1989, but he never received compensation for his wrongful imprisonment. Number 2. Ricky Jackson, Wiley Bridgeman, and Kwame Ajamu, wrongfully convicted in 1975. In Cleveland, Ohio, Ricky Jackson and brothers Wiley Bridgeman and Kwame Ajamu were wrongfully convicted of murder based on false eyewitness testimony from a 12-year-old boy, who later recanted. The trio spent decades in prison before being exonerated in 2014. Their wrongful conviction became one of the most famous cases of systemic injustice. Number 1. Ray Krone, wrongfully convicted in 1992. Ray Krone's story is a chilling example of how unreliable forensic evidence can lead to wrongful convictions. In 1991, a bartender in Phoenix, Arizona, was brutally murdered, and Krone, a former postal worker with no prior criminal record, was quickly arrested. The prosecution's case rested heavily on bite mark evidence, which claimed Krone's teeth matched the marks found on the victim's body. Despite Krone maintaining his innocence and willingly providing a bite impression, the so-called expert testimony proved damning. In 1992, he was convicted and sentenced to death. These cases revealed the fallibility of the justice system, with racial bias, false testimony, and insufficient legal representation playing significant roles in these wrongful convictions. Should stories like these make us reconsider the death penalty? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more videos.